As we've just hit 1 minute past one, I'll officially start. So, as I mentioned, I'm Clare Fussell from Operation Noah, and Operation Noah is an ecumenical Christian charity that works to inspire greater church action on the climate crisis. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this webinar, which is, for those of you who've joined us for the last two, it's the third in our series on church action on sustainable land use. This is particularly looking at church investment and ways in which we can collectively use our wealth and our funds to help address unsustainable land use and think about how we can best use the land around us for climate and nature. If you missed the other two that looked at local and landscape level case studies, they are available to watch on our YouTube channel, and we'll circulate the links to those after this session as well. Today, we're really excited to welcome a host of speakers exploring how we can use our investments to support initiatives that both protect and restore land and benefit communities. And each of our speakers will be focusing on one of the three priority areas of growing trees, protecting peat, and sustainable farming. And I'm going to keep my introduction very short to leave plenty of time to hear from each of them. I'll hand over shortly to my colleague Sharon Hall, who leads on our church land use campaign, and she will give a brief introduction to that. And then we're going to be hearing from Caroline Pomeroy, and she is the CEO of Climate Stewards, which is a charity that works in the global south and directs church investment and Christian investment into projects there. Caroline has a background in commercial property and making maps for cyclists. And she spent 5 years working on community and environmental projects in Ghana and Rwanda. And she's directed Climate Stewards for the past 12 years as well. And she'll be joined by her colleague Prosper. Prosper Kwame Antwi is joining us from Ghana, where he leads a programme of tree growing and reforestation that's supported by Climate Stewards. And then we'll be hearing from Rolf Hogan, who's joining us from the Landscape Finance Lab. He's the Wetlands Programme Advisor there, and he project manages their involvement with peatlands. They work with Peatlands Finance Ireland and Waterlands, and Rolf has a long background in biodiversity and sustainability financing. So we're really pleased to be hearing from Rolf today as well. And then we'll be handing over to John. And John Weakliam is the CEO of Vita Impact. And he set up the programme in Eritrea in the year 2000 and also established Vita's first programmes in Ethiopia in 2005. And he's been the CEO of Vita that's based in Ireland since 2008. And his focus is going to be on the sustainable farming programme and the potential for investment there. So welcome to all our speakers, and thank you again for being with us. We're excited to hear from you in a moment, but I'll first hand over to Sharon, who's going to tell us a bit more about the Operation Noah Church Land Use campaign.
So I've talked a little bit about our church land use campaign in the previous two webinars, but I know not everybody was present at those. So I'll give you a brief overview of the targets that we are highlighting for churches in the UK on the topic of church land use. We know that different churches own more or less land themselves, so the ways that they participate in these targets may vary. But the main areas are summarised in our church land use vision and on this slide here. So we're asking churches to be more transparent about what lands they own and how they use it. We know that some churches have not even mapped all of that land to know exactly where it is and how it's being used. So that's a key priority. Then we're asking them to look at what are the carbon emissions, other greenhouse gas emissions from their land, and how can they be reducing them. And then drawing in the priority of biodiversity as well, how more of the land should be protected for nature. And then the three main areas which we've identified within our Church Land and the Climate Crisis report, where churches can really make a difference for climate in how they use the land, is about growing trees, protecting peatland, and supporting farmers to reduce emissions, sort of summarising that as supporting farm net zero. And we've talked about these as sort of key areas where we want churches to take action, and they all should be reflected in the webinar today. Many of you will have seen these resources already, but I want to highlight them to you again. Each of the resources on those three key areas starts off by explaining why this is important for the climate, and then has a page of sort of local church action on that topic, a page of larger scale landscape action, which was reflected more in our second webinar. And then the fourth page of each of these 4-page resources looks at how you can invest in these climate solutions. And actually 2 of the speakers here today feature on the respective growing trees and protecting peatland resources. So we're making the connections to these resources, which are concise but inspiring, have different examples of how different church groups and other organisations can help churches to invest and to make progress in using their land for these things which are so good for the climate. So I think I've just summarised actually that slide. This is what is in each of the resources. There's plenty of links to useful partners and ways to find out more. As well as these 3 resources, there's a lot more resources on our website, links to videos, links to articles and blogs, links to partner organisations who can help people make progress to these. So all of that is available through the church land use page on our website. So I commend that to you as well. And then a brief update on our open letter campaign. So as those of you who will have been at the previous 2 webinars will know, we handed in an open letter asking church leaders, national church leaders, to take action on these areas of our church land use vision on World Environment Day, which was the 5th of June, so last month. So we had people handing in the letter in person to 5 different church leaders in London, and then to 2 in Scotland and 1 in Wales as well. And then the final one was posted. So we've got some photographs there. We had some really good conversations on the day with representatives from these different churches. And we've already been having some follow-up conversations online with church leaders and people who are involved in land use in particular. So there will be more updates to come on that open letter in the months to come. So if you're not already signed up to our newsletter, I'd really suggest that you do that. That's also accessible through our website. So there will be more to share from this campaign in the future, and we're hoping to have more to say about the response to this open letter. But it has been handed in, so there's no need to sign it at the moment, but there will be other ways of taking this campaign action forward. So I'll stop sharing that now and go back to Claire.
Thank you, Sharon. So over to you, Caroline and Prosper, if you're able to share your screen.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. Thank you very much to Sharon and Claire for your invitation to join this webinar. Just to say that my name's Caroline. I'm the Director of Climate Stewards. And we're going to share this time, Prosper and I. Prosper works for Rocha, Ghana, which is one of our partners in the Global South. In fact, definitely our longest standing partner. So we've got just a short 5 minutes each to tell you a bit about what we do to help churches invest in sustainable land use. So just a bit of background, Climate Stewards is part of the Rocha family of organisations. We are the only Rocha organisation that cuts across all the other international boundaries, as it were. So we essentially fund carbon mitigation programmes in about 6 countries currently around the world. I'm going to talk today about Rocha, Ghana. So we've been doing this for about 18 years, working with Rocha, Ghana as our first partner, funding community carbon projects. That's all back to front. Let me do that in the right order. We work with a lot of different Christian organisations. So we work with some church denominations. We work with the Anglican in the UK. We work with the Anglicans, the Catholics, Methodists, URC, and a lot of Christian organisations as well. So charities and NGOs on all these different aspects of their carbon footprint. So we encourage them to measure it. So we have online tools for churches and individuals to measure their footprint. We then encourage them, obviously, to reduce it, to decarbonise what they can, and then to offset it. And that's really what we're talking about today. And then, obviously, to communicate that to their supporters, their stakeholders, and to review it, to keep going. So we kind of see it as it should be a downward spiral as people's emissions reduce. But where we kind of started and what we're talking about today is planting and grow. Well, we prefer to call it growing trees than planting trees for obvious reasons, with our partners around the world, particularly in Ghana. Sorry, yeah, and that's just some of the partner organisations who are funding this work. So just to say, in terms of investment, I guess our investment model is not is different from some others. So we are encouraging people to offset their carbon emissions. So we enable them to calculate their carbon footprint and then to pay an amount of money which is invested in projects which take that carbon back out of the atmosphere. That's essentially the model that we are using. And we've got about 2,000 churches from the UK currently using our carbon footprint calculator, of which around 60 in the last year have been offsetting. So not huge numbers, but significant numbers of churches across the UK and beyond. And the kind of projects we're funding we're going to talk about Ghana in a moment, but tree planting in Kenya and Ghana and Tanzania, clean cook stoves in Nepal, recycled plastic in Uganda. And we've also got projects we're kind of coming to the end of funding currently in Uganda with cook stoves as well, and Peru as well. So a number of different technologies which mitigate carbon. Over the years, we developed what we call our seal of approval, which is essentially our in-house standard for measuring carbon removals or reductions. As you may know, the big third-party standards are extremely expensive and onerous. And so we realised that working with very small community-based projects, we wanted to find a way which was rigorous, which was transparent, which ensured additionality, which means that any carbon, we're only counting additional carbon which has been removed from the atmosphere. They're accurate, we're transparent, we're very cautious and conservative about the way we measure and record our carbon savings. That the projects are really sustainable, which means that they are owned by the local community. They're not just done to the community. So they're fully embedded in the local community, and they bring in multiple local benefits. Obviously, we know the benefits of trees, but all the other benefits that these kind of projects bring in terms of health, livelihoods, etc., etc. So this is our framework for measuring and counting carbon. Things, as you may know, some of you may know, are changing because of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We can talk about that later if you're interested, but for the time being, this is our framework. So that's the seal of approval, which is what we use. And we have, a piece of software we've developed for counting and measuring the carbon savings, which essentially takes the data from our partners, from their monitoring, builds it into a framework which enables us to estimate the future savings of future mitigation of carbon. And it takes into account all the kind of risks that are inherent in these kind of projects. So whether that's fire or drought or flooding or pests or neighbours cutting down your tree or all the sort of things that go wrong, we know those happen. So we include a very large risk buffer margin. And we take into account, the location of the project and therefore the expected growth rate of the trees, the density of planting, and all the other factors which will affect the tree species, etc., which will affect the quantity of carbon which is sequestered, which is locked up. And these projects are funded ex ante, which means in advance. So we are basically funding the promise of carbon absorbed by these trees as they grow, but we are taking into account all the risks of the fact that they may not all grow. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Prosper. I hope you're there, Prosper, who will talk a bit more about the work that we're funding in Ghana at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caroline, and good afternoon to us all. I'm Prosper Kwame, Antwi, Programs Manager of Rocha, Ghana. Sorry that my camera is not on. It's because of the internet. It's quite bad here, and I'm sure it will interfere. But to sort of, this is the person speaking to you, and I'll go off, after this. So thank you so much. So as rightly indicated by Caroline, we've been working with communities, and then we've been working with families, we've been working with schools within the Lake Busumtree catchment area. Lake Busumtree is a biosphere reserve, and it also falls within the Upper Guinean forests. It has a high biodiversity area, and it's also an important bird area. So over the years, we've been working with Climate Watch specifically to ensure that lands are managed sustainably. And so the picture we see in this is a Blaze family land, and this is where we started the planting. We just want to give a clear-cut situation of what is done. So we started the planting, for instance, on this farm, a family farm, in the year 2020. And so I want to indicate that our project with Kwame Stewards is more of community-owned, because we plan with them, we act with them, and then we achieve together to gain and then realize the gains for the project. So here, Blaze family, if a land is given and dependent on what particular model the farmers want to use, we give them technical guidance, and then we all agree the framework. I want to indicate that for Climate Stewards, over the years, we've been using indigenous tree species so as to ensure that we have a biodiversity of the land areas, and also to ensure that we sustain the land in terms of its productive capacity. And so it is also important for us to understand that for Climate Stewards model, we also give opportunities for farmers to also integrate on their farms particular fruit tree species. So the farmer has the right to choose a particular fruit tree species wherein they would want to have, and the idea is to sort of help them with their nutrition, and also to give them some model of income even as the trees grow over the period. So for instance, with the Blaze family land, they planted different indigenous tree species such as Terminalia superba, Terminalia ivolensis, Kaya ivolensis, and Nuclear dendrica. These are some specific indigenous tree species that were planted. And this is the key contact person for the Blaze family, whom we've been working with. But on their farm, they also integrated Persea americana, that is avocado. So Caroline, if you go to the next slide, I think there is a slide. Yes, so, and currently this is Persea americana. So what happens is that, I mean, once they have the tree species on the land, they also have particular fruit trees where they can, I mean, harvest and sell to give them forms of income as well as nutrition, even on their lands. And I want to say that over the years with Climate Stewards, because the program also has a component of payment for ecosystem services, farmers and communities are being supported in terms of their livelihoods, because smallholder farmers have the opportunity of using payments that are made to sort of support the families, to support the schools, the school children, and also communities use related payments to support community management protocols and production protocols. And so we want to show these are some of the current stance of some of the plantations that we have. And this specifically is the Blaze farms. They now have almost a story, a covering story. And it's important to mention that for most of our engagement, not only do we have trees that are mitigating climate, but also we use some of the sites, especially with students, for learning purposes. Caroline, if you may go to the next slide. So for our protocols, we also give the opportunity where we learn, or we help students learn about climate change. We help them understand key protocols. The idea is to train them to be agents of change, and also to make decisive decisions when it comes to climate change. And so we teach them different dendrometric measures, where we want to help them understand how maybe we can calculate carbon by using different dendrometric measures, like the DBH, the crown canopy size, and then the canopy measures. So we use this to help them understand, so as for them to grow, being clear agents of change for climate and the global world as large. So I want to say a very big thank you, and want to say that we are all making gains together, and together we'll continue to grow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prosper. I think that wraps up our summary of what we're up to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you to Prosper as well. Really great to hear that introduction to Climate Stewards and how you work, and fantastic to see that growth over just 5 years of the trees planted. Prosper, thank you for sharing those photos, and interesting to see the added value as well of the income diversification and benefits in terms of nutrition and educational programs as well. It just feels like a real win-win-win, doesn't it, of churches being able to offset and invest in these sorts of projects and see such clear and tangible gains. So thank you so much for sharing that. We hand over now to Rolf, and Rolf, over to you to tell us a little bit more about the Landscape Finance Lab and your work there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Claire and Sharon, for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Rolf Hogan. I'm landscape lead with the Landscape Finance Lab. So we're an organization that was initially, so if you go to the second slide, that would be great. We were set up, we came out of WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and then became an independent organization in around 2021. So our vision is really around a world where nature, communities, and economies thrive again in harmony. So really underpinning sustainable development. But our specific role is really to work with landscapes to incubate them and to help them deliver on their conservation goals and their social goals, but also to bring in financing to help them to do that. And we've a methodology that we use to do that. And I won't get into all of the details, but we'll touch on some of it. And so a lot of our work then is working with the landscapes, working with investors and financiers, and then also trying to spread the learning of between different landscapes. So the next slide then, I think is a summary basically on peatlands. So we're very involved. We're a global organization. We work across different biomes of forests, lakes and rivers, coral reefs. But we've worked a lot on peatlands recently, especially in the British Isles. So the top three bullet points there are three large landscape initiatives that we've been working with to incubate. So that means helping them to develop, understand how they can get investment and help them to access it. And we'll get into more details a little bit later. But then we also have what we call our Peatland Finance Collective. So that's where we bring together other landscapes that are interested in developing and attracting investment. And so we're slowly building up a network across the British Isles under this Peatland Finance Collective, and we meet a couple of times a year to do that. And then just on the right, this is our publication, Investing in Peatlands. So this was published last year. So it's basically a summary of why invest in peatlands, why they're important, and what the benefits are of the investment, and also to investors. The next slide, please. So then when we talk about landscapes, it's often a concept that we hear a lot about in the nature conservation world. And it's really about, let's say, from a conservation perspective, a more sensible approach to working and conserving nature. So what's different about it? Well, it's usually compared to a project, you're working at a large scale, so about 100,000 hectares or more. It's multi-sectorial, so the idea is you identify your landscape and you work then with different sectors, government sectors, so forestry, water management, agriculture, and also business and other stakeholders, including local communities. And you try to develop a joint vision and a joint understanding of how the landscape should be managed. And so some areas will go for conservation, some will remain in farming, hopefully sustainable farming, and then some other areas may go for restoration or for other uses. So it's kind of a landscape planning, if you like, approach. And then where we often work is with organizations, with the initiative. So they've developed a partnership and trying to help them to develop a structured organization, or sometimes financial mechanisms like a fund, for example, that we can help them to bring in or engage with investors, develop the projects on the ground, and bring in the investment into those projects. And the benefits to investors are there's an economy of scale. So some investors, they have a minimum ticket size of, I don't know, 10 million, 100 million. And so by working at landscapes, they can access aggregations of projects. So, one landscape might put together 50 projects. They've all been developed in a coherent way, using the same methodology, etc. And so an investor can come in and decide then to invest in some or all of those projects. There's very strong stakeholder support usually if it's a good landscape, which helps to avoid any potential problems from disagreements, let's say, with local communities. There are many co-benefits from working by taking a holistic approach. So, for example, water is often the best way to talk about this. If you're working on a project, midstream in a river, if something goes on upstream, that can impact on your project. But by taking a more holistic approach and working with a whole river basin, for example, then you can start to make sure that the water, you've got more certainty that you're going to have a good water flow coming out of that river basin. There's going to be clean water coming out at the end of the day. So that gives generally, working at landscape scale, we talk about enhanced ecosystem resilience because you're working at that scale. If there's problems in small areas, there's a larger buffer, if you like, across the whole landscape that can absorb certain shocks. And so that gives an investor then sort of reduced risk because they've got a strong governance in place. It means less financial risk and for less ecological risk for their particular projects. And then this diagram is just looking at, when we work with landscape financing, we're looking at different types of projects. So some will be for-profit projects and others will be non-profit. So they'll be government supported or NGO supported projects. The next slide, please. So this is just when we talk about peatlands, it's in some ways they're kind of like the super ecosystem, especially when it comes to carbon. So the statistic we see a lot in the peatland world is that peatlands cover 3% of land surface, but hold around 30% of land-based carbon. So that would be twice as much as the world's forests. So for in a very small area, it's due to the depth of peat, of course, in many areas, and it's been laid down for thousands of years. Water, peatlands are super important for water, especially for ensuring purification of water. So about 25% of the UK's drinking water comes directly from peatlands, another 70% from, let's say, peatland dominated catchments. And then it's also, peatland basically acts like a giant sponge, so it helps to retain water and release it slowly. So in times of drought, there's still water available. And that can also help to buffer the impacts of flooding because there's more water held or absorbed by the land and it's not all immediately flowing off. Of course, important for biodiversity, especially for birds, breeding birds and migration. And then, of course, immense cultural importance. I mean, there's sometimes people think negatively of peatlands, but also there's a huge amount of archaeology. Many of our iconic landscapes involve peatlands, be they, the Peat District, the Dartmoor. I was just down there recently. These landscapes, a lot of it is made up from peat. And there's also leisure and tourism increasingly, and paludiculture, which is basically like wet farming. So the next slide, please. So then just very quickly, the types of projects. So when we talk about investment, where are the actual returns? So there's carbon credit type projects. So there's the IUCN UK Peatland Code. There's now a new standard in Ireland also dealing with carbon. There's water benefits that companies can be interested in investing in. So there's a way to measure that called volumetric water benefits. And so that looks at the amount of water retained by the peatland compared to previously, and also the purity of the water that comes out. Then on biodiversity in the UK, there's biodiversity net gain, which can help to fund some restoration projects and potentially also biodiversity credits into the future. We also see corporate financing. So this is not necessarily for a return, but say water companies, for example, often invest in peatland restoration because that reduces the costs for them in terms of removing the brown color from water, which can often be quite expensive. And then paludiculture, as I mentioned, this wet farming, there's potential there for that to be developed in many peatland areas. And of course, there's a lot of public financing that goes into peatland restoration. And so often there's a combination of public financing with something like carbon credits to allow for a benefit to occur. And just to the next slide, please. This is just a bit of work that was done in Ireland. So let's say the commercial return depends very much on the type of peatland you're looking at. So in some cases, like on the left, this is where it's going to be very difficult to get a commercial return, but because of basically the cost of the restoration. So some areas that are forested and you need to remove the trees, or very high in the mountains where you need do a lot of work by hand, will be more expensive and will not provide a return. But over on the right, this intensive grasslands is basically, this is work done in Ireland. There's a peat layer under a lot of grassland areas in Ireland, and by raising the water level, you can then protect that peat and stop it from emitting carbon. So you can produce carbon credits at a fairly minimal cost, which then allows for a higher return. The next slide, please. And this is just to show, again, there's an example from Ireland that there's a kind of a movement beyond carbon. And so in Ireland, they've developed what they're calling an ecosystem certificate. So that's bringing together all of the benefits, basically, from peatland restoration. So biodiversity, carbon, community benefits, wildfire reduction, water services, and then sort of selling those as one certificate is the idea. They're yet to understand how much one of these certificates will be worth. They're still piloting them, but it seems to be the direction that's happening in many countries. And I think there's a lot of interest in the let's say the business sector for buying these type of certificates rather than just carbon credits or biodiversity credits. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just to sort of note where we are in terms of investment. Peatlands and investing in peatland restoration is maybe still seen as sort of fairly risky for investors. So we're over here in this 2023-25 timeline where we're still piloting a lot of these projects on the ground, understand how things will work, what kind of returns they'll have, and basically develop a proof of concept. But going forward, we would hopefully start to look at scaling this work across those landscapes and into new landscapes, and generating an increased flow of capital. And then finally, to the right, our aim is to get to a kind of, let's say, mature market where there's established standards for restoration for these certificates or carbon credits. And sort of, let's say, there's a recognized asset class of peatland restoration by investors, and that's where maybe there could be sort of larger commercial type investment coming in. So the final slide then. I hope I'm within. Oh, sorry, two more slides. Part of the scaling, something that the Finance Lab has done is we've developed what we call this nature positive landscape facility. There's two bits to it. So one bit is a fund, which will invest then in nature positive impacts funds globally, and that's currently in development. And then on the right, we've got to support that what we're calling a landscape accelerator. And that's basically, as explained earlier, where we're working with the landscapes to get them ready for investment. And so the idea is that we work with the accelerator and develop the fund, and this can help them sort of scale up this investment into the future. And so the final slide is basically, I'm sorry I had to sort of go through everything so quickly, but maybe sort of giving you a taste for peatland financing and investment. But if anyone's interested in further follow-up, we can organize a call with the lab to kind of get into a deeper dive on peatlands or this M+ facility. We could connect you with some of these landscapes if that's interesting. So especially the Peatland Finance Ireland, the Great North Bog in the north of England, or the Flow Country up in Scotland. And then we also have these regular meetings of our Peatland Finance Collective. And again, we've had some investors who've joined that, and you're welcome to come along. And then again, reminder, we've got this publication as well that you can read to get more information. But thank you very much. And I hope I remained within my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Rolf. And that's a huge amount of information for 10 minutes. So thank you so much for squeezing that in for us. That's absolutely fascinating and really interesting to hear about how returns can be made from this landscape level investment, and particularly thinking about the future of these kind of more holistic biodiversity-led ecosystem certificates as well, to kind of create new asset classes in the future as well, aside from carbon credits. So that's really, really fascinating. I've got questions bubbling, but I won't ask them now. I will pass on to John Weakliam. And if anyone else has questions that are sort of at the top of your mind, do put them into the chat, and we're taking a note of them, and we'll come back to them in the Q&A. So over to you, John, and really excited to hear all about your work at Vita Impact.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you to Sharon. Thank you to everybody here for having the opportunity to meet such an esteemed audience. I will fly along with the same Irish tones you've been listening to, but I'll try to. People are probably have heard a lot of information, so I'll try to go fairly gently through it. Are you seeing my shared slides?
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. So we're Vita, means way of life in Latin, livelihoods. So our focus on land preservation is through the lens of a family living in rural Africa who are addressing the landscape within the context of their livelihoods and access to the basic services which are so much in short supply. We have the distinction of having been set up with Mother Teresa as our founding patron back in 1989, but we are a secular organization, but very much entrenched in the principles of Catholic social teaching. And I'll just go through to slide 4 and skip some of the detail. But these principles are marvelous for our sector, bottom-up development. Subsidiarity is a great Catholic social teaching about bringing autonomy and decision-making to the lowest possible level. And that, in our case, means households in rural Africa or their communities, and ensuring that they are driving their own development. And we use a quite sophisticated model called community-led total cook stove, CLT, which was developed by an Indian man called Kamal, who's a global luminary. And the whole purpose of community-led total service delivery is every single household participates and chooses to adopt what is being recommended. And that's the principle of subsidiarity which we apply. And moving straight into the model we use, on the right side of the slide you're looking at, you see this is our mission statement, which is the woman in the home. And she is the driver of development. She is the person who has the most suffering, drudgery, and potential to transform the life of her family if she's given the kind of support she might need. And in the slide, you see a picture there of a stove. You see the water outside the home. You see the tree. That's what Vita does. We provide basic services in rural Africa for women in the home. And looking at this slide, which is really the focus, it's the easiest way to encapsulate what we do. To get away from grant-only funding, we set up an investment model in 2016 with support from Cantor Fitzgerald in Ireland and with support from 7 Irish religious congregations who actually have put investments into a 2 million pilot, which was a blended finance of 75% loans and 25% grant, which was invested into communities in Africa in carbon saving, landscape regenerating activities. So 300,000 people did receive the benefits of this project using the community-led model, which means access to cook stoves and access to water. And how does water save carbon? Well, if you provide clean water, the water does not need to be boiled, trees do not need to be cut, carbon emission is therefore saved. So it's a carbon avoidance project similar to cook stoves. The third pillar of our work is the planting of trees by communities. We registered our projects with Gold Standard and we generated 2 million tons of carbon emission savings, which we then sold as carbon credits to non-greenwashing, I need to hasten to add, to non-greenwashing climate leaders who are on a journey to net zero and who see carbon offsetting their carbon footprint as part of that journey. So having successfully completed the pilot in 2022, we started a scale-up of the project to a 10 million fund, which involves 7 million euros of investment, which again comes from Irish Catholic congregations in the US mainly, as well as in Ireland. And there are, again, 7 organizations who have invested in the fund. They get a 6% return on their investment. So we blend their investment with grants, and currently in the process of delivering clean cook stoves and safe water to 1.3 million people in Ethiopia and in Eritrea. We are a small organization, so we're in 2 countries, Ethiopia and Eritrea. In Eritrea, which is a strange and wonderful country I lived in 14 years, they don't like aid. They don't accept aid, so we're the only international organization able to work there. The reason they allow us to operate is because of the innovation that they see in our work, and the Vita Green Impact Fund would be a good example of that innovation. So we're 2 years into this new 10 million fund. So far, we've reached 640,000 people with these carbon-saving stoves and clean water. And we've a third pillar, which is the planting of 20 million trees by communities in Ethiopia. Our projects are all registered with Gold Standard. We have set up an investment fund with a manager. So Vita is a charity. We don't do fund management. So here in Dublin, we set up a fund manager, which is some quite senior people in the Irish world of investment, including the former member of the Irish Climate Advisory Council, Professor Jerry Boyle, and some senior figures from the world of banking. So that Vita Green Impact Fund is a sister organization of Vita, which effectively provides professional management services, investment services to our investors, reports on a quarterly basis. We provide an annual impact report, which sets out what has been delivered to communities. Everything is third-party verified through the Gold Standard mechanism. Gold Standard provides a very interesting third-party verification of work done, because credits have to be audited in order to be issued. Therefore, third parties come to the projects, they check on who has received what, they do a sample audit, and they're able to report to the Gold Standard that what we said we did has indeed been done. So that is a way of providing the investors with a comprehensive third-party verification of work done. We're now looking to scale up our fund to a 30 million euro fund by expanding the number of investors, by expanding the amount of grant in a ratio of approximately €3 of investment for every one of grant. There is enormous demand for these basic services. So if you take Ethiopia alone, the government wants to get adoption of clean cook stoves up from 10% to 75% in 10 years. That would mean the provision of 31 million cook stoves in that time scale, which would generate approximately 30 million tons of carbon emission saving, which is about 50% of Ireland's national carbon footprint, for example, which means that this type of work can generate significant volumes of carbon emission savings that under Article 6 will provide investors, but also governments and corporations with the opportunity to participate in a global framework where carbon emission savings can be traded as internationally transferable mitigation outcomes from country to country. So, for example, within the UK, where the government is looking at its climate action plan, these types of credits that provide impact in communities that have a degree of integrity which is sometimes been missing in our sector, but which is now being ramped up, that whether it's the UK government, for example, whether it's investors in the UK, and in particular, of course, impact investors who believe that impact means impact. Unfortunately, the term sometimes does suffer with what is impact. BlackRock have a definition of impact that we wouldn't share, for example. And this is where the partnership with the church has enormous value because of the Laudato Si mandate, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. How do we support people who are suffering from the vagaries of climate? How do we address their needs while addressing the climate imperative? And I think this type of model may have great resonance in the future for investors who want to deliver on these principles. And we look forward over the coming years to working with such investors. And we really hope that we might have the chance to work with UK-based congregations and the religious, because this is something we feel that the church has leadership on, that will not be driven in the way that we would envisage outside of church investors. Commercial investors having that separate definition, we feel, of impact that doesn't lend itself in the same way to what we're trying to achieve. So that's, I have other slides, but I'm conscious of time and people I could go on like, but I shouldn't. So I hand you back to Clare, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, for that introduction. And if you'd like to, share some of these slides with those present, we could also link to these afterwards. So we'll double check on that and hopefully send them round, because there's a lot of really fascinating content there. Thank you. I'm really interested to see how you've built up over the 3 different investment opportunities and are sort of scaling that up as you learn and grow through the Green Investment Fund. And I saw some questions coming in around how to factor in various carbon savings with the use of biomass stoves and things like that. So I'm sure we will come to those in a moment. But I thought it was very fascinating as well that you only sell back to climate leaders and try and avoid greenwashing at the other end of the scale as well. So that's really interesting to see. Well, thank you so much to all our speakers. I won't keep wittering on, but I will open up the floor to all of you to put your questions to those speakers. I've been making a note as we've gone through, and I think the first question came in from Akalu, and that was for Caroline. And Caroline, you may have seen that in the chat. I'm just scrolling up to find it again.
Was it about working in other countries?
In other countries, that's right. Do you have plans to expand your work to other countries?
Good question. So yes, you can. I'm unmuted. Thanks, Akalu. We work in a number of countries already. We are currently, as I mentioned earlier, and John referred to this as well, the world of carbon investment is changing due to the impact of the Paris Agreement, which is a good thing. It's becoming more robust, more capable of external accreditation and evaluation. But from our point of view, as an organisation which has always focused on really small community-based projects, the kind of thing that Prosper was describing earlier, that's an interesting challenge for us, because to jump through those hoops is incredibly expensive. These gold standard type projects cost tens of thousands of pounds to just get to the point where they're ready to be accredited. So at the moment, we're focusing on a few large, we're focusing on basically Rocha Ghana will be our first, we hope, accredited project. We're also going to switch to a different model of funding, which is going to be called making contributions to carbon projects, where it's a bit nuanced, but it's around what people can claim and what they can't claim. So essentially, they're funding good work, but they can't claim the carbon as their own offset because it's going towards the national. In what they call NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So in short, we're not currently looking for new partnerships in new countries, although I hope that in the future that we might come back to that.
Thank you, Caroline. That's helpful to understand. There was a question as well from Judith to Rolf, which was around, are there any landscape finance projects that encompass fenland peat?
Yes, is the short answer. I think you'll have in all the places I mentioned, you will have some fens, as well as blanket bog and raised bog. So I think so, yeah, very much so.
I could briefly share. I know there is a National Trust project in one of the fens in Cambridgeshire, which has been highlighted on our Invest in Peatlands page of our resource there as well.
Excellent. So Judith, maybe an opportunity to connect up there and get in touch about potential for projects together in the fens. There's a question from Mick, and I think this might be for Rolf as well. Mick, I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm not quite sure where exactly in the presentation your question came in, but that is how much private investment potential is there, and what's the interest now and potential for the future?
Interesting. There are figures for billions of money available from private investment. I couldn't tell you exactly what I've seen figures sort of discussed, but I couldn't tell you exactly how much is out there. But what we are seeing that's interesting is that companies seem to be moving away from credits, at least let's say in peatland, or let's say nature restoration in Europe, and more towards reporting. So there, under the EU, there's the common reporting framework, where companies need to report in on the benefits they're having in the environment. And that's seen as an incentive, or it is incentivizing a lot of companies to actually go out. They still like the third-party verification. So, for example, this Irish standard where they look at different ecosystem services and they measure them robustly. Again, like the gold standard, there's a third-party verification. But they may not necessarily be using that for carbon credits. They may just want to use it for actually reporting into the European Union, to show what the company's doing, or its positive outcomes in terms of the environment and social issues as well. So I think that's a very interesting development, and it certainly seems to be very strong in the work we're doing in Ireland.
Thank you. And John, there's the question that's come in for you, seeing as it's very inspiring for us as a faith-based charity to hear about how Vita Impact was established with the support of churches and religious institutions, and it continues to be a place where churches and faith groups can invest. And there's a question around, well, how do churches get to hear about these initiatives and how do they get involved? Because it's not always on leaders' radars. And do you want to say a little bit about how you might sort of work with faith audiences to involve them, John?
Thanks, Claire. We were very fortunate through some connection, Kira, my colleague on this Zoom. There is an organization in the US called the Catholic Impact Investment Collaborative. And I think, Claire, you're familiar with them. John O'Shaughnessy, a marvelous man who works with FSM and has been a leader in both the US and I'd say globally. He has been a leader in establishing a structure whereby Catholic religious and faith-based investors more broadly can access a forum to collaborate and understand better what the opportunities are, and try to get away from the kind of straitjacket that sometimes the fund managers impose, whereby they're kind of these types of the high impact projects are de-risked out of the marketplace, and which is a tragedy, really, because in the end you end up with stocks and shares, and the projects that have the most impact simply don't get the chance to participate. There is a small group in Ireland unfolding, which is similar to the Catholic Impact Investment Collaborative. But Operation O is a fantastic organization we didn't know about until more recently. And we would love to think that there's great opportunity to collaborate across jurisdictions. And we really need to get together, because otherwise people are siloed and stuck with their fund managers. No disrespect to fund managers, but they have a certain characteristic, really. We worked with Cantor Fitzgerald on the pilot fund, but we wouldn't work with them again, not because they're not good people, but because they don't share the impact first mandate that we feel as a charity is paramount. So the answer to that would be through Operation No and similar organizations. I think collaboration is absolutely urgent and compelling need for people who want to deliver on Laudato Si.
Well, thank you very much, John. And yes, and we hope that this webinar and this series of webinars has been a small part of trying to give the opportunities to those involved in church decision-making and financial decision-making of what's out there and how churches can get involved. And that might be quite a good segue over back to Sharon, because I think Sharon wanted to share a little bit about the Green Investment Declaration. And that's an opportunity led by Operation Noah and the Just Money movement in the UK for churches to invest and commit to longer term investments, increasing over time, into climate solutions. So Sharon, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
I will. So I did put a link in the chat, because we have lots of information about the Green Investment Declaration, and I'm only going to give a really brief overview here today. But we are a major part of Operation Noah's work is encouraging investment in climate solutions, and we're asking churches and faith groups to step up the investment that they're making in climate solutions. And this Green Investment Declaration is a way that churches can say, yes, we are committed to doing this. Even those who have made a commitment to do their very first investment in climate solutions within 2 to 3 years can sign up at our acorn level. And then there's a sapling level. Once churches have invested already in climate solutions, they've made that investment and communicated about it. And then the aim that we're hoping people will get to is the oak level, which shows that 5% of the church organisation's assets are invested in climate solutions. So that would be the oak level. So I can just briefly highlight some of the early signees of the Green Investment Declaration. So it can be done at a diocese level. So the Diocese of Truro have invested around 10% of their investment portfolio into particularly renewables through local projects, and then some centred funds as well. The Society for the Holy Child Jesus, so a Catholic religious order, have opted for this Paris-aligned investment solution, which takes them up to the gold level of our Green Investment Declaration. And then in terms of denominations, the Quakers in Britain were the first to sign up to our Green Investment Declaration. They're building on a long history of ethical investment priorities, but they are also at the gold level in terms of investing in climate solutions. So there's lots more about it on our website, but if it's something that you would be interested in taking forward with your church, either at regional level or denominational level, or if your church does have investments themselves, then the steps would be to have a look at your investment policy, see if it lines up with your faith values, and if it doesn't, look at changing it. We'd ask you to then ask your finance directors to table a discussion about joining the Green Investment Declaration. We have lots of resources that will help you do these things. And then once that decision's been made, then you can sign the declaration and publicly communicate about it. And again, we've got logos and information. We've made videos about some of these early adopters as well. So there's lots more to find out about green investment through our website, but we wanted to flag the very obvious connection today. So I'll hand back to Clare.
Thank you, Sharon. And as I mentioned before, links to all that's been spoken about today and the investment declaration as a way that you can take a next step will be shared by email afterwards. I'm aware that we're running out of time, but I think we've got 2 more minutes. I think we probably sneak in one more question. And I've seen that there's something that's come through from Mick. Do we need to target the investors, the investment sector and fund managers? Yes, I think that the short answer to that is Mick, and I think that one way in which churches can do that is to raise the question as clients to their fund manager, saying, what are we investing in? I know that we have various exclusions to our funds, but what might we more proactively include, and making the demands for particularly shared funds to include more investment in climate solutions, whether that be renewables or nature-based solutions, as we've heard today, and thinking outside the box and outside of our kind of traditional fund management into more impact-led investment opportunities, as we've heard today. And it doesn't have to be all of it. You don't have to move 100% of your investments into kind of riskier areas. I mean, if you're starting with 2, 3, 4%, and then seeing how that tracks over time. If all churches did that, can you imagine the billions that we would have to really make a difference in these sorts of impact-led projects around the world? It would be amazing. So that's what we're hoping to build a movement towards. So thank you so much for all of you and for coming and joining us today. And thank you in particular to our speakers, to Caroline and Prosper and Rolf and John. I feel like we could have given an hour to each of you. There's so much to gain from what you had to share. So thank you so much for your brevity, but also for giving us such inspiration today. And we look forward to learning more about each of your organisations and ways that we might support you in the future. So thank you very much.